In Pinewood Hollow, Judge Walter Hainsworth fines Kendra Morrison for her over-the-top Christmas decorations, igniting a clash of rules versus holiday cheer. As tensions rise, both discover that Christmas magic lies not in lights or laws, but in unexpected connections and the power of community. Like and subscribe for more stories. In the small, picturesque town of Pinewood Hollow, nestled between sprawling evergreen forests and snow-dusted hills, Judge Walter Hainsworth had earned a reputation. His name was synonymous with precision, discipline, and an almost draconian adherence to the law. His courtroom, a relic of 19th-century craftsmanship with its polished oak panels and brass accents, was as much a symbol of his personality as it was a place of justice. Today was like any other December day for Walter. Snow drifted lazily outside the courthouse window, painting the world in shades of white and gray. Inside, Walter was reviewing the day's docket, a steaming cup of black coffee. His third, gripping his attention almost as tightly as the stack of papers in front of him. Noise complaints, parking violations, expired permits, he muttered to himself. Another day, another parade of people who think rules don't apply to them. Walter was a man of habit. His mornings began at precisely 6 a.m. with a brisk walk, regardless of weather. By 6:30, he was seated at his kitchen table with the day's newspaper and a bowl of oatmeal, plain and unadorned. By 8 o'clock, he was at the courthouse, his desk neatly organized, ready to tackle the day. He liked his world orderly, predictable. But as his gray eyes landed on the complaint form about 142 Maple Lane, his orderly world felt just a bit more chaotic. The address was all too familiar. Kendra Morrison. Walter pinched the bridge of his nose. Not again, he said aloud, though the empty office offered no response. Kendra Morrison had become something of a local celebrity, or nuisance, depending on who you asked. A vibrant, energetic woman in her mid-30s, Kendra had moved to Pinewood Hollow 3 years ago and quickly made her mark. She was bold, unapologetic, and, in Walter's opinion, entirely too comfortable bending, or outright breaking, the rules. Her offense this time was a holiday display described in the complaint as excessive, disruptive, and inappropriate for the quiet character of Maple Lane. Walter scanned the details. According to the report, her front yard boasted a 12-foot inflatable Santa Claus, a synchronized light display that blinked in time to Christmas music blasting from outdoor speakers, a mechanical snow machine that covered the sidewalks in a fluffy, artificial white powder. Walter couldn't help but roll his eyes. She's turning the neighborhood into a theme park, he muttered. But it wasn't just the decorations. This was personal, or at least it felt that way. Walter prided himself on maintaining Pinewood Hollow's charm, and Kendra's antics seemed to thumb their nose at the town's traditions. He pulled out her file. Last year, she'd received a warning for a similarly over-the-top display. Walter had been lenient then, hoping she'd learn her lesson. Clearly, she hadn't. This is why leniency doesn't work, he said, reaching for his pen. Walter began drafting a fine notice, the words flowing with practiced efficiency. His mind wandered briefly to the woman herself. He'd never spoken to her directly, but he'd seen her around town, usually surrounded by a small crowd, her laughter carrying through the air like a bell. She was the type of person who seemed to light up every room she entered, a stark contrast to Walter's quiet, reserved demeanor. Linda, his secretary, interrupted his thoughts with a knock at the door. She stepped inside, carrying a stack of files. "Morning, Judge," she said, placing the files on his desk. Her sharp eyes scanned the fine notice he was writing. "Ah, the Morrison case. Again?" Walter sighed. "She was warned last year, Linda. This time, she needs to understand that the rules apply to everyone." Linda hesitated, adjusting her glasses. "I know she can be a bit much, but it's Christmas. People like her decorations. It's part of what makes the season feel festive. Festive is one thing. Turning Maple Lane into Las Vegas is another." Walter capped his pen and folded the notice. "She'll get this fine by tomorrow. End of story." Linda gave a small nod but lingered for a moment longer. "Do you ever think maybe you're a little hard on people, Judge?" Walter stiffened. Hard on people? I'm hard on rules. There's a difference. Linda didn't argue, but her silence spoke volumes. That evening, Walter drove home along Maple Lane, his car's headlights cutting through the soft glow of holiday lights lining the street. Most homes had modest displays, strings of white or colored bulbs, the occasional wreath or inflatable reindeer. But as he approached 142 Maple Lane, the modest glow gave way to an explosion of light and sound. Kendra's house was impossible to miss. The towering, inflatable Santa Claus swayed slightly in the wind, his jolly red figure illuminated by dozens of floodlights. The synchronized lights flashed in time with a lively rendition of Jingle Bell Rock that blared from outdoor speakers. Faux snow sprayed into the air, drifting lazily onto the sidewalk where children laughed and played. Walter pulled his car to the curb, his jaw tightening as he took it all in. To most people, the scene might have seemed magical, even charming. But to Walter, it was chaos. "This is exactly why we have codes," he muttered, his fingers tightening on the steering wheel. He thought briefly about confronting Kendra then and there, but the sound of laughter and music made him think better of it. He wasn't in the mood for a public spectacle. No, the fine would do the talking for him. Later that night, Walter sat in his quiet living room, the only sound the faint crackle of the fireplace. He stared at the mantel where an old photograph of his late wife, Margaret, took pride of place. Margaret had loved Christmas, quiet, elegant Christmases. Her decorations had been understated. A simple tree, a wreath on the door, and candles in the windows. Walter felt a pang of longing as he gazed at her smiling face. Margaret had been gone for nearly a decade, but the holidays always brought her memory rushing back. Maybe that was why he felt so out of place these days. The world seemed louder, brighter, and more chaotic than ever. For a moment, he wondered what Margaret would think of Kendra Morrison and her exuberant display. He could almost hear her gentle laughter. "Oh, Walter," she'd say, "don't be such a Grinch." He shook the thought away, his resolve hardening. Margaret might have had more patience for Kendra, but Margaret wasn't here. It was up to Walter to maintain order in Pinewood Hollow, no matter how unpopular it made him. And so, as the clock struck midnight, Walter finalized the fine notice, confident that he was doing the right thing. What he didn't realize was that this decision would set off a chain of events that would challenge everything he thought he knew. About rules, about community, and about himself. If Pinewood Hollow had a beating heart, it was Kendra Morrison's house at 142 Maple Lane. From the moment she moved into the quaint New England town 3 years ago, Kendra had made it her mission to inject life, color, and energy into every corner of her new community. She wasn't content to be just another face in the crowd. She wanted to be the neighbor who remembered your birthday, brought over fresh cookies when you were having a bad day, and threw the kind of parties people talked about for months. And Christmas? Christmas was her magnum opus. That morning, Kendra stood outside, hands on her hips, surveying her masterpiece. Her front yard was a festive explosion of lights, inflatables, and music, all coordinated with the precision of a Broadway production. A mechanical reindeer swayed its head back and forth. Fake snow drifted in the air from her snow machine, and her prized 12-foot inflatable Santa grinned at passers-by with unabashed cheer. Kendra adjusted her knit beanie, her breath visible in the cold December air. "Perfect," she said to herself, though she knew perfection was never quite enough for her. She reached for the remote in her pocket and pressed a button. The synchronized lights blinked to life, pulsing in time with Mariah Carey's "All I Want for Christmas Is You." Her neighbors might roll their eyes, but Kendra knew the kids loved it. And to her, that was what mattered. "Mrs. Morrison," a voice called out. Kendra turned to see 2 young boys bounding down the street, their cheeks red from the cold. They stopped at the edge of her yard, staring in awe at the display. "It's Miss Morrison, kiddos," she said with a wink. "I haven't snared a husband yet, but thanks for the vote of confidence." The boys laughed. "Can we play in the snow again?" one of them asked, pointing to the faux snow piling up on the sidewalk. "Of course," Kendra replied, gesturing toward the machine. "But keep it on the sidewalk. I don't want your mom mad at me for soaking your clothes again." As the boys dove into the frothy snow, Kendra's neighbor, Carol Martin, stepped onto her porch next door, her arms crossed over her chest. Carol was in her 60s, with steel-gray hair always pulled into a tight bun and a permanent expression of mild disapproval. "Kendra," Carol called, "don't you think it's a bit much this year?" Kendra grinned and walked to the edge of her yard. "A bit much? Carol, it's Christmas. If I don't go all out, who will?" Carol sighed, her breath fogging in the air. "You know people talk, right? About the lights, the music, the spectacle." "Let them talk," Kendra said with a shrug. "If it makes them smile even for a second, it's worth it." Carol softened, shaking her head with a faint smile. "You've got a good heart, Kendra. Just don't forget, not everyone has your energy." "Noted," Kendra said, though she wasn't planning to dial it down anytime soon. Inside her cozy, slightly cluttered home, Kendra's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. She grabbed it, balancing it on her shoulder while stirring a pot of hot cocoa. "Hey, Aunt Thelma," she said, recognizing the caller ID. Her aunt's warm, familiar voice crackled through the speaker. "Girl, I saw the pictures you sent me. You've outdone yourself this time. That Santa is bigger than your house." Kendra laughed. "It's a statement piece, Auntie. Go big or go home. You've got that small-town spirit, that's for sure. But don't you let those folks get you down. Not everyone's going to appreciate your, enthusiasm." Kendra's smile faltered for just a moment. "I know, Aunt Thelma, but I don't do it for them. I do it for the kids, for the community. And for you," her aunt added gently. Kendra didn't respond right away. Her aunt had a way of cutting through her cheerful facade. It was true, decorating, organizing, and hosting were more than hobbies for Kendra. They were how she coped, how she filled the empty spaces in her life that had been there since losing her parents in a car accident when she was just 20. Christmas had always been their favorite time of year, and carrying on their traditions felt like keeping them close. "Well, someone's got to keep the Christmas spirit alive," Kendra said, shaking off the heaviness in her chest. "Anyway, I've got a batch of cookies in the oven. I'll call you later. You better. And send me more pictures," Aunt Thelma said before hanging up. That afternoon, as Kendra packed boxes of homemade gingerbread cookies to deliver around town, a sharp knock sounded at her door. She opened it to find a uniformed officer standing on her porch, holding a folded envelope. "Miss Morrison," the officer said, clearly uncomfortable. "This is for you." Kendra frowned, taking the envelope. She opened it and scanned the contents, her eyes widening as she read the fine notice. "Violations of Pinewood Hollow Municipal Code. Obstruction of public pathways. Noise ordinance breach." Her voice trailed off. The officer shifted awkwardly. "Judge Hainsworth issued it himself." Kendra's expression hardened. Of course he did. By the time Kendra finished her cookie deliveries that evening, her mood had soured. The fine wasn't just an inconvenience. It felt like a personal attack. She'd worked tirelessly to make her house a source of joy for the town. And this was how they repaid her? She knew Judge Hainsworth by reputation. Rigid, humorless, and about as festive as a lump of coal. But she hadn't expected him to target her like this. She stood on her front lawn, glaring at the lights and decorations that had brought her so much pride just hours earlier. For the first time, she wondered if it was all worth it. Then she heard the laughter. Across the street, a group of children was gathered, their faces lit up with wonder as they watched the synchronized lights dance to the beat of Rockin' Around the Christmas Tree. Their joy was infectious, and Kendra felt her resolve returning. "No," she muttered to herself. "I'm not backing down." That night, Kendra sat at her kitchen table with a pen and notepad, drafting a plan. If Judge Hainsworth thought he could kill her Christmas spirit with a piece of paper, he had another thing coming. She was going to fight this fine, and she was going to make sure the whole town knew exactly what kind of man he was. But as she scribbled ideas, a new thought struck her. Maybe this wasn't just about her decorations. Maybe it was about something deeper, something Pinewood Hollow needed to confront. After all, she wasn't just any resident. She was the host of the town's annual Christmas festival, a role she took seriously. If this fine was meant to silence her, what message would that send to the community? Kendra smiled to herself, a mischievous glint in her eye. You want to fight Judge Hainsworth? You've got one. The morning after receiving the fine, Kendra Morrison woke up with renewed determination. She wasn't about to let some grumpy judge ruin her Christmas or her reputation. If Judge Hainsworth wanted to play hardball, she was more than ready to swing for the fences. Her first stop was Pinewood Hollow's courthouse, an imposing brick building that loomed over the snowy downtown square. Kendra had never set foot inside the place, and she wasn't entirely sure what to expect. But as she pushed open the heavy oak doors, she felt her resolve harden. She wasn't here to make a scene. She was here to make a point. Judge Walter Hainsworth was in the middle of reviewing zoning disputes when a sharp knock sounded at his office door. "Come in," he said without looking up, his pen scratching against paper. The door opened, and Kendra stepped inside, a storm of energy in a bright red coat and matching scarf. Walter glanced up, his brow furrowing as he took her in. He recognized her immediately from her reputation, and from the house that had been giving him a headache for the past 2 Christmases. "Miss Morrison," he said, setting his pen down. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Kendra didn't waste time on pleasantries. She marched up to his desk and dropped the fine notice in front of him. "This." Walter leaned back in his chair, folding his hands over his stomach. "I see you've received your notice. Good. It's about time someone addressed the excessiveness of your display." Kendra's eyes narrowed. "Excessive? It's Christmas, Judge. You can't celebrate Christmas halfway." "I'm not saying you shouldn't celebrate," Walter replied evenly. "But there are rules, Miss Morrison. Pinewood Hollow has ordinances in place for a reason. Noise limits, light restrictions, public safety. Your display violates all of them." Kendra crossed her arms, her voice rising. "Do you have any idea how much time and effort I put into that display? It's not just for me. It's for the whole community." Walter's expression didn't change. "And yet, several members of the community have filed complaints." Kendra felt a flash of anger. "Who? Carol Martin? She thinks my lights are too cheerful. Harold down the street? He calls the cops if my car's parked too close to his mailbox. These people aren't complaining because I'm breaking the law. They're complaining because they don't like me." Walter raised an eyebrow. "This isn't personal, Miss Morrison. This is about upholding the town's standards." "Oh, it's personal," Kendra shot back. "You've singled me out before. Last year, you sent me a warning about my Halloween decorations. I didn't hear a peep about the guy 2 streets over who turned his front yard into a zombie apocalypse." "That was different," Walter said stiffly. "Different how?" Kendra pressed, leaning over his desk. "Different because his decorations weren't as bright? Or different because I'm the new girl in town, and I don't fit your picture of what a Pinewood Hollow resident should look like?" Walter bristled, his voice sharpening. "I suggest you tread carefully, Miss Morrison. If you're implying—" "I'm not implying anything," Kendra interrupted. "I'm stating a fact. You've made me a target, Judge, and I'm not going to stand for it." The room fell silent. For a moment, the only sound was the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Walter studied Kendra, his gray eyes cold and calculating. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not like this. Finally, he spoke. "If you believe this fine is unjust, you're welcome to appeal it. There's a process for that." "Oh, I'm appealing it," Kendra said, her voice firm. "But I'm also going to make sure everyone in this town knows exactly what's going on. This isn't just about Christmas decorations, Judge. This is about what kind of community Pinewood Hollow wants to be." Walter's lips thinned. "I'm not interested in turning this into a public spectacle." "Well, you should have thought about that before you put me in your crosshairs," Kendra replied. "Because if there's one thing I know how to do, it's draw a crowd." Kendra left the courthouse with her head held high, though her heart was pounding. She'd stood her ground, but she knew this was just the beginning. Walter Hainsworth wasn't the type to back down easily, and if she wanted to win this fight, she'd need more than passion. She'd need allies. That afternoon, Kendra gathered a group of friends and neighbors in her living room. The group was diverse: young parents, retirees, shop owners, and a few teenagers from the high school drama club. These were the people who had supported her since she moved to Pinewood Hollow, the ones who had embraced her exuberance instead of trying to stifle it. "Here's the deal," Kendra said, pacing in front of the fireplace. "Judge Hainsworth fined me for my Christmas display. He says it's against the rules, but we all know this isn't about the rules. It's about control. He doesn't like that I do things differently, and he's trying to shut me down." Several heads nodded in agreement. Carol's teenage grandson, Ethan, raised his hand. "What can we do to help?" Kendra smiled. "I'm glad you asked. I want to turn this into something positive. If he thinks my display is disruptive, let's show him what disruptive really looks like, in the best way. I want to make this year's Christmas festival the biggest, brightest, and most inclusive event Pinewood Hollow has ever seen." The room buzzed with excitement. Ideas flew back and forth. More decorations, a bigger parade, live music, and a charity drive to collect toys and coats for families in need. By the time the meeting ended, Kendra had a detailed plan and a small army of volunteers ready to bring it to life. Meanwhile, Walter sat alone in his office, replaying the confrontation in his mind. Kendra's words had struck a nerve, though he wouldn't admit it to anyone, not even himself. She was wrong, of course. This wasn't personal. Couldn't be. He was simply doing his job, enforcing the rules that kept Pinewood Hollow running smoothly. But as the day wore on, doubt began to creep in. Was he being fair, or had he allowed? He couldn't afford to second-guess himself. Not now, not ever. By the end of the day, Pinewood Hollow was buzzing with whispers of the brewing battle between Judge Hainsworth and Kendra Morrison. Some sided with Walter, calling Kendra's display over the top and disrespectful to tradition. Others rallied behind Kendra, praising her for bringing joy and energy to the town. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just about Christmas decorations anymore. It was about identity, community, and what Pinewood Hollow stood for. And as the holiday season unfolded, the stakes would only get higher. The news of Kendra Morrison's confrontation with Judge Walter Hainsworth spread through Pinewood Hollow like wildfire. By the end of the week, nearly everyone in town had an opinion about the fine and what it meant. Some saw it as a much-needed measure to preserve the town's charm and quietude. Others believed it was an unjustified attack on a woman who had done nothing but bring holiday cheer to the community. Pinewood Hollow, which prided itself on being a tight-knit and harmonious town, was now divided. At Millie's Cafe, the unofficial hub of Pinewood Hollow gossip, the fine was the only topic of conversation. Millie herself, a stout woman in her 60s with a permanent streak of flour dusting her apron, stood behind the counter pouring coffee while customers debated at full volume. "I'm with the judge on this one," grumbled Harold, a retired postal worker whose house was 2 streets over from Kendra's. "She's turning Maple Lane into a circus. We moved here for peace and quiet, not a theme park." "Oh, give it a rest, Harold," snapped Lucy, a young mother balancing a squirming toddler on her hip. "My kids love her display. It's the only thing that makes this town feel alive during the holidays." Harold huffed. "There's a difference between feeling alive and giving everyone a migraine. You're just mad because your lights are dimmer than your personality," Lucy shot back. The room erupted in laughter, though the tension was palpable. Millie sighed, setting down a tray of cinnamon rolls. "If y'all put half this energy into decorating your own houses, we wouldn't be having this conversation." Kendra, meanwhile, had become something of a local celebrity. People stopped her on the street to offer words of support, and her inbox was flooded with messages from neighbors volunteering to help with the Christmas festival. It was clear that many residents saw her as a symbol of Pinewood Hollow's evolving identity, a vibrant, diverse town where tradition could coexist with creativity. One chilly Saturday morning, Kendra held an impromptu rally in the town square. Dozens of residents showed up, bundled in scarves and coats, holding homemade signs with slogans like, "Let Christmas Shine," and "Lights of Joy, Not Rules to Annoy." Standing on a makeshift stage, Kendra addressed the crowd with her characteristic warmth and humor. "I want to thank all of you for being here today," she began, her voice steady despite the nerves twisting in her stomach. "When I moved to Pinewood Hollow, I fell in love with this town. The charm, the people, the way it felt like stepping into a Hallmark movie." The crowd chuckled, and Kendra smiled. "But what makes this place special isn't just the old brick buildings or the snow-covered trees. It's the people. It's all of you. And Christmas is the time when we come together to celebrate what makes us a community." She paused, her gaze sweeping the crowd. "Judge Hainsworth might see my decorations as a violation of the rules, but I see them as an invitation to laugh, to sing, to be joyful. And I'm not about to stop spreading that joy just because one person thinks it's too much." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers echoing through the square. Kendra stepped down from the stage, her cheeks flushed with both cold and excitement. She knew the battle wasn't over, but in that moment, she felt unstoppable. While Kendra's supporters rallied, Judge Walter Hainsworth found himself under a different kind of spotlight. At the grocery store, at church, even during his morning walks, people approached him to share their opinions, most of them uninvited. "Walter, you've got to let this one go," said Pastor Williams, stopping him after Sunday service. "It's Christmas. We're supposed to be spreading love, not fines." "This isn't about Christmas, Pastor," Walter replied tightly. "It's about enforcing the law. But sometimes the law needs a little grace," the pastor said, placing a hand on Walter's shoulder. "Isn't that what the season is about?" Walter didn't respond, but the pastor's words lingered with him as he walked home. He had never cared much for public opinion, but the sheer volume of criticism was starting to wear on him. As the days passed, the divide in the community grew sharper. Social media became a battleground, with hashtags like #TeamKendra and #TeamHainsworth popping up alongside spirited debates. Some residents organized a petition to have the fine revoked, gathering over 100 signatures in just 2 days. Others wrote letters to the editor of the Pinewood Gazette, defending Walter's decision and calling for stricter enforcement of town ordinances. At the center of it all, Kendra and Walter continued their lives, each refusing to back down. For Kendra, the fight had become about more than just her decorations. It was about standing up for herself and the values she believed in. For Walter, it was a matter of principle, and perhaps a way to cling to the order and control that had defined his life for so long. One evening, as the snow fell heavily outside, Walter received an unexpected visitor at his home. He opened the door to find Carol Martin, Kendra's next-door neighbor, standing on his porch with a thermos of hot cocoa in hand. "Carol," Walter said, surprised, "what brings you here?" Carol stepped inside, shaking the snow from her boots. "I came to talk some sense into you, Walter." Walter sighed, motioning for her to sit. "I don't need a lecture." "Good, because I didn't bring one," Carol said, pouring cocoa into 2 mugs. "I just want to know why you're so determined to dig your heels in on this." Walter frowned, staring into his mug. "It's not about her, Carol. It's about the rules. If we start bending them for one person, where does it end?" Carol leaned back, studying him. "Do you really think this is about rules? Because it seems to me like you're using them as a shield." Walter's eyes narrowed. "A shield from what?" "From everything you don't want to face," Carol said gently. "The world's changing, Walter. Pinewood Hollow is changing. And maybe that scares you." Walter didn't respond, but her words struck a chord. He had spent his entire life preserving the town's traditions, but now he wondered if those traditions were worth preserving at the cost of alienating people like Kendra. By the end of the week, Pinewood Hollow felt like a town on the brink. The Christmas festival was fast approaching, and tensions between the 2 factions threatened to overshadow the holiday spirit. Kendra, undeterred, threw herself into preparations for the festival, enlisting volunteers to help transform the town square into a winter wonderland. Meanwhile, Walter remained steadfast in his position, though doubt gnawed at the edges of his resolve. Both of them knew that the festival would be a turning point, not just for their conflict, but for the town itself. The week before Christmas, Judge Walter Hainsworth sat alone in his dimly lit study, the ticking of the grandfather clock his only companion. Outside, the snowstorm that had been forecasted all week had finally arrived, blanketing Pinewood Hollow in a deep, quiet white. It was the kind of storm that might have felt magical to someone else. A child, perhaps, or a woman like Kendra Morrison who embraced the joy of the season with unyielding vigor. But Walter didn't feel magic. He felt tired. He rubbed his temples, staring at the pile of paperwork on his desk. His decision to find Kendra had spiraled into something far bigger than he had anticipated. The town was divided. Social media posts about the Grinch judge had reached his ears, even though he avoided such platforms himself. At church, Pastor Williams had gently implored him to show the kind of grace the season calls for. Even his longtime friend and neighbor Carol Martin had begun to question him. Walter pushed back his chair and walked to the window, pulling aside the heavy curtains to peer into the storm. Across the street, his neighbor's modest holiday lights twinkled faintly through the snow. They reminded him of the way Margaret used to decorate their house. Simple, tasteful, and understated. She'd always insisted on white lights instead of colored ones, and she would spend hours arranging them just so. Margaret. Walter let the curtain fall and returned to his chair, sinking into its worn leather embrace. It had been 10 years since she passed, but the ache of her absence felt as raw as it had the day she'd left. She had been his balance, his heart, the one person who had understood the man behind the stern exterior. Without her, Walter had thrown himself into his work, using the rigidity of the law to fill the void she had left. But lately, even that hadn't been enough. Walter's thoughts drifted to a Christmas long ago, when he and Margaret had been newlyweds. They'd moved into their little house on Pinewood Lane that fall, full of dreams about the life they would build together. That December, Margaret had convinced Walter to help her hang lights for the first time. "You know I'm no good at this," Walter had grumbled, fumbling with a string of tangled bulbs. Margaret had laughed, her eyes sparkling. "That's why I'm here to supervise." Her laughter had been infectious, and by the time they finished, Walter had to admit their little house looked beautiful. They'd stood on the sidewalk together, hand in hand, admiring their work as snow began to fall. It was one of those rare moments in life where everything felt perfect. But perfection didn't last. Years later, when Margaret was diagnosed with cancer, Christmas lost its magic for Walter. Her treatments stretched on for months, and by the time December arrived, she was too weak to decorate. Walter had tried to bring her holiday cheer. He'd set up the tree, cooked her favorite holiday meals, and even hung the white lights on their porch. But nothing could stave off the inevitable. Margaret passed away 2 days after Christmas, leaving Walter alone in a house that felt too big and too quiet. Since then, Walter had avoided the holiday as much as possible. He couldn't bear the memories it stirred. The town's festive decorations, the cheerful music, even the smell of pine. It all reminded him of what he'd lost. Over time, he'd channeled his grief into an obsession with rules and order, as if maintaining control could keep the pain at bay. But Kendra Morrison's exuberance was a force Walter couldn't ignore. She was everything Margaret had been: joyful, creative, and full of life. Her decorations, her laughter, even her defiance. It all reminded him of the woman he'd loved and lost, and it terrified him. Walter's reverie was interrupted by a knock at the door. He glanced at the clock. It was nearly 9 p.m. Frowning, he opened the door to find Carol Martin standing there, bundled in a thick coat and holding a casserole dish. "Carol," he said, surprised, "what are you doing out in this weather?" "I could ask you the same thing," Carol replied with a wry smile. "But I figured you could use a warm meal. You've been looking, well, let's just say you've looked better." Walter sighed and stepped aside to let her in. Carol placed the casserole on his kitchen counter and removed her gloves, her sharp eyes scanning the room. "Still haven't put up a tree, I see," she said. "I don't do trees," Walter replied gruffly. "You know that. You didn't used to be this way," Carol said, pulling out a chair at the kitchen table. "There was a time when you loved Christmas as much as anyone. That was a long time ago, Walter said, sitting across from her. Things change. Carol studied him for a moment before speaking. This thing with Kendra. Why are you so determined to make it a battle? It's not a battle, Walter insisted. It's about enforcing the rules. Carol shook her head. No, Walter. It's about you. You've been holding on to this grief for so long, you don't know how to let go. But maybe it's time you did. Walter's jaw tightened. You don't know what you're talking about. Don't I? Carol's voice softened. I knew Margaret, Walter. I knew how much she loved this season. And I know she wouldn't want you to spend the rest of your life shutting out the very thing that brought her joy. Walter looked away, his chest tight. He wanted to argue, but deep down he knew Carol was right. Margaret would have loved Kendra's decorations. She would have marched right up to that woman's front door and invited herself in for cocoa. And she would have laughed at Walter's gruffness, telling him he was being ridiculous. I don't know how to move on, Walter admitted quietly. Carol reached across the table and took his hand. Start small, she said. Maybe with a little forgiveness for yourself and for others. After Carol left, Walter sat alone in his quiet house, her words echoing in his mind. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to think about Christmas. Not as a reminder of what he'd lost, but as a chance to honor what he'd loved. He thought about Margaret's laughter, her joy, and the way she made everything brighter. Maybe Carol was right. Maybe it was time to let some of that light back into his life. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to see Kendra Morrison in a new light. In the days leading up to the Christmas festival, Pinewood Hollow buzzed with activity. Snow covered the town square, blanketing the cobblestones in a pristine white that sparkled under the early morning sun. Shopkeepers hung garlands and lights across their storefronts. Children built snowmen in front yards, and the unmistakable scent of cinnamon and pine wafted from every corner of the town. Kendra Morrison was at the heart of it all. She stood in the center of the square, clipboard in hand, directing a group of volunteers as they set up booths and decorations for the festival. Her energy was infectious, and even those who had initially been skeptical of her excessive holiday spirit couldn't deny the excitement she brought to the event. Kendra, where do you want the cocoa stand? One of the volunteers called out, struggling to pull a heavy cart across the icy ground. Right next to the tree, Kendra replied, motioning toward the massive spruce that towered over the square. It had taken 3 trucks and a small army of workers to haul it into place, but it was worth the effort. The tree was the centerpiece of the festival, and Kendra had spent weeks planning its decorations. Don't forget the fairy lights, she added, pointing to a box of tangled cords. We're going for magical, not minimalist. Despite the cold, Kendra felt a warmth in her chest as she watched the preparations unfold. This was why she loved Christmas. Not the gifts or the parties, but the way it brought people together. The festival was a chance for the town to forget its differences, if only for a night, and celebrate what made Pinewood Hollow special. As she turned to check on another group of volunteers, she spotted a familiar figure walking through the square. Judge Walter Hainsworth. He was bundled in a heavy coat and scarf, his usual stern expression softened by the cold. Kendra felt a flicker of annoyance but pushed it aside. She had bigger things to focus on than his disapproval. Walter stopped a few feet away, his gaze sweeping over the scene. He didn't speak, but Kendra could feel his presence like a weight on her shoulders. Finally, she turned to him, crossing her arms against the chill. Come to see what all the fuss is about? She asked, her tone brisk but not unkind. Walter hesitated, his breath visible in the cold air. I came to see how the preparations were going. Well, as you can see, we're doing just fine without your approval, Kendra said, gesturing to the bustling square. Anything else? Walter frowned, clearly unused to being spoken to so directly. But instead of responding with his usual sharpness, he surprised her. It looks impressive, he admitted. Kendra raised an eyebrow, caught off guard by the compliment. Thanks, I guess. They stood in awkward silence for a moment, the sounds of laughter and hammering filling the air around them. Walter seemed to be searching for the right words, his expression shifting between discomfort and something that looked almost like regret. Kendra, he began, his voice quieter than she'd expected. I've been reflecting on some things. About the fine. About the way I've handled this. Kendra stared at him, her heart beating faster. Was this the same man who had fined her without a second thought? She didn't respond right away, waiting for him to continue. I won't pretend I understand you, he said slowly, or your enthusiasm. But I've come to realize that perhaps I've been too rigid, too focused on rules and not enough on what they're meant to protect. Kendra felt a lump rise in her throat. She wanted to be angry, to call him out for the trouble he'd caused. But there was something in his tone, an honesty, a vulnerability, that softened her resolve. Well, she said after a long pause, it's a start. Walter nodded, seeming to accept her words as more than they implied. He glanced around the square again, his eyes lingering on the tree and the decorations. The festival means a lot to this town, doesn't it? It does, Kendra said simply. It's about more than just Christmas. It's about community, about showing people they belong, no matter who they are or where they come from. Walter looked down, his hands buried deep in his coat pockets. Margaret, my late wife, used to say something similar. Kendra blinked, caught off guard by the personal revelation. She hadn't expected him to share anything about himself, let alone something so deeply private. She loved Christmas, Walter continued, his voice tinged with sadness. She made it special. For me, for everyone. After she passed, I guess I lost sight of that. Kendra didn't know what to say. She had never seen this side of Walter before. The man behind the judge, the man who had loved and lost and built walls around himself to keep the pain at bay. I'm sorry, she said softly, for your loss. Walter nodded, his gaze distant. For a moment, they stood in silence, the noise of the festival preparations fading into the background. Then, almost reluctantly, Walter spoke again. I'll rescind the fine. Kendra's eyes widened. You will? Yes, he said, meeting her gaze. I should have handled it differently. And I'd like to help with the festival, if you'll allow it. Kendra stared at him, her mind racing. Of all the outcomes she'd imagined, this wasn't one of them. But as she looked at Walter, she saw not the stern, unyielding judge who had fined her, but a man trying to make amends. A smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. All right, Judge, let's see what you've got. Walter's lips twitched into a faint smile, the first Kendra had ever seen from him. And as they walked through the square together, discussing decorations and logistics, Kendra realized that maybe, just maybe, Pinewood Hollow was about to have its most memorable Christmas yet. The day of the Christmas festival arrived with a brilliant winter sunrise. The snowstorm had cleared overnight, leaving the streets of Pinewood Hollow sparkling under a sky so blue it felt painted. The entire town square had been transformed into a holiday wonderland. Garlands and twinkling lights lined every storefront. The massive Christmas tree at its center glittered with ornaments and fairy lights, and the smell of hot cocoa and roasted chestnuts filled the air. Kendra Morrison stood at the heart of it all, clipboard in hand and a scarf wrapped snugly around her neck. She directed volunteers with her usual mix of charm and efficiency. But today, there was an extra spring in her step. The past week had been a whirlwind, but she had done it. Against the odds, the festival was happening, and it was everything she had hoped for. Miss Morrison, Ethan, one of her high school volunteers, ran up to her, nearly slipping on the ice. The choir's warming up at the gazebo. Do you want to check the sound system? I trust you, Ethan, Kendra said with a grin. Just make sure they're loud enough to drown out Harold if he starts complaining. Ethan laughed and ran off, his breath visible in the cold air. Kendra took a deep breath, letting the sights and sounds of the festival wash over her. Families were arriving in droves, children bundled in puffy coats and scarves, their laughter mingling with the jingle of bells and the cheerful strains of holiday music. Booths selling handmade ornaments, baked goods, and steaming cups of cider were already busy with customers. It was perfect. Across the square, Judge Walter Hainsworth arrived quietly, blending into the crowd as best he could. He had debated whether to come at all, but after his conversation with Kendra, He felt it was the right thing to do. His presence wasn't just about rescinding the fine or making amends. It was about reconnecting with a part of himself he had long buried. Walter had to admit the festival was impressive. The decorations, the organization, the sheer energy. It was clear how much love and effort Kendra had poured into the event. And as he walked through the square, he couldn't help but feel a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. Not quite joy, but the faintest hint of it. "Judge Hainsworth?" A voice called out. Walter turned to see Carol Martin waving at him from a booth selling homemade candles. She had a mischievous glint in her eye as she approached. "I didn't think I'd see you here. I thought it was time," Walter said simply. Carol nodded, her expression softening. "It's good to see you out, Walter. And for what it's worth, I think Margaret would have been proud." Walter didn't trust himself to speak, so he just nodded. Carol patted his arm and returned to her booth, leaving him to wander through the square alone. Meanwhile, Kendra was making her rounds, greeting festival-goers and checking on the various activities. As she passed the cocoa stand, she spotted Walter standing near the tree, his hands in his coat pockets, looking uncharacteristically thoughtful. "Judge," she said, walking up to him, "didn't expect to see you here." Walter turned to her, his expression unreadable. "I said I'd help, didn't I?" Kendra smiled, tilting her head. "You don't strike me as the decorating type. Let me guess. Logistics." "Actually," Walter said, his tone dry but not unkind, "I'm here to judge the gingerbread house contest." Kendra laughed, genuinely delighted. "Oh, this I have to see. Do you even know what makes a good gingerbread house?" "I've been brushing up," Walter replied with a faint smile. "Structural integrity, creativity, use of materials." Kendra shook her head, still laughing. "You're something else, Judge." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching as a group of children ran past, their cheeks flushed with excitement. Walter glanced at Kendra, his voice quieter when he spoke again. "This is impressive. What you've done here." Kendra looked at him, surprised by the sincerity in his tone. "Thank you. It's not just me, though. The whole town came together for this." Walter nodded, his gaze distant. "I can see that, and I can see why it means so much to you." Kendra's smile softened. "It's about more than just the decorations, you know. It's about reminding people they're part of something bigger, that they belong." Walter didn't respond, but his eyes lingered on the tree, the laughter, the lights. For the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of the warmth and connection he had once shared with Margaret. It wasn't the same, but it was something. As the evening approached, the festival reached its peak. The choir performed carols at the gazebo, their voices carrying across the square. The tree lighting ceremony drew a crowd so large it spilled into the nearby streets. Kendra stood near the front, her heart swelling as the tree came to life in a cascade of lights and colors. The crowd erupted in cheers, and for a moment, everything felt right. Walter stood at the edge of the crowd, his stern exterior softening as he watched the scene unfold. He spotted Kendra near the tree, her face lit with a joy that was impossible to ignore. She caught his eye and gave him a small, knowing smile. He nodded in return, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at his lips. For the first time in years, Walter felt the weight of his grief begin to lift. It wasn't gone, he knew it never would be, but it felt lighter. And as he stood there, surrounded by the sights and sounds of the festival, he realized something he hadn't allowed himself to believe in a long time. Christmas wasn't just about rules or tradition. It was about people, about connection, about finding light in the darkness. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late for him to find that light again. The festival wound down as the first stars began to twinkle in the clear night sky. The crowd thinned, with families returning home, arms full of handmade crafts and leftover treats. The tree still shimmered in the center of the square, its lights reflecting off the snow like tiny stars scattered across the ground. Kendra Morrison was among the last to leave, still chatting with volunteers as they packed up booths and cleared the square. Despite her exhaustion, her smile never wavered. The festival had been a resounding success, and the joy it had brought to Pinewood Hollow was tangible. As she finished helping with the final cleanup, she noticed a familiar figure lingering near the tree. Judge Walter Hainsworth stood quietly, hands clasped behind his back, gazing up at the towering spruce. Kendra hesitated for a moment before walking over to him. "Didn't expect to see you still here, Judge," she said, her tone light but curious. Walter turned to her, his expression unreadable. "I thought I'd stay and take it all in." Kendra raised an eyebrow. "And? What do you think?" Walter was silent for a long moment, his eyes tracing the tree's glowing ornaments. "It's remarkable," he said finally. "What you've done here, what you've given to this town." Kendra crossed her arms, tilting her head. "That almost sounds like a compliment." Walter gave a faint smile, the kind that seemed to cost him effort but was no less genuine for it. "It is." The silence between them was heavy, not with tension, but with something unspoken. Kendra waited, sensing that Walter had more to say. "I owe you an apology," he said at last, his voice low. "For the fine. For how I handled everything." Kendra blinked, caught off guard. "Well, that's unexpected." Walter chuckled softly, a sound so rare it startled even him. "I imagine it is. But it's true. I was wrong to fine you. And I was wrong about you." Kendra softened, the edges of her defenses lowering. "What changed your mind?" Walter hesitated, searching for the right words. "I've spent a long time holding on to things, grief, regret, a need for control. I thought that by enforcing the rules, I could keep everything in order. But I see now that sometimes the rules aren't what matter most." Kendra studied him, her own heart aching at the vulnerability in his voice. "What does matter most, then?" Walter met her gaze, his gray eyes steady. "People, community, the things that bring us together, not the things that divide us." For a moment, Kendra didn't know what to say. She had spent weeks fighting Walter, seeing him as nothing more than a rigid, unyielding authority figure. But now, standing before her, he was just a man. A flawed, grieving human man trying to make amends. "Thank you," she said quietly. "That means more than you know." Walter nodded, his posture relaxing slightly. "I hope I can do more than just apologize. I'd like to help however I can. If you'll let me." Kendra smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest. "You know, Judge, I think I might just take you up on that." They stood together for a while, watching the tree as the last of the volunteers finished packing up. Kendra broke the silence first, her tone playful but sincere. "You know, you didn't have to wait until after the festival to tell me all this. We could have used your help setting up." Walter smirked, the expression almost boyish. "I figured I'd be more useful after observing how things work." "Smart," Kendra said with a laugh. "But next year you're on booth duty." "Next year?" Walter asked, his eyebrow raised. Kendra grinned. "Oh, you're not getting out of it that easily. You're part of the team now, Judge." Walter chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I'll hold you to that." As the last of the booths was cleared away and the square grew quiet, Kendra and Walter parted ways. But something had shifted between them. Something neither of them could fully articulate, but both of them felt deeply. It was as though a weight had been lifted, leaving room for something new to grow. Walter walked home that night, the snow crunching beneath his boots, his breath visible in the crisp air. For the first time in years he felt lighter. The quiet streets of Pinewood Hollow seemed less lonely, the lights in the windows less distant. He thought of Margaret, of her laughter, of how she would have loved Kendra's festival. And as he unlocked his front door and stepped inside, he realized something. He hadn't just apologized to Kendra, he had forgiven himself. Meanwhile, Kendra returned to her cozy home, her heart full. She poured herself a cup of cocoa and sat by the window, watching the snow fall. Her mind lingered on Walter, on the unexpected connection they had formed. She thought of the battles they had fought, the lessons they had learned, and the bridges they had built. Christmas wasn't about perfection, she realized. It wasn't about decorations or traditions or even festivals. It was about people, flawed, messy, wonderful people, and the love they shared. And this year, more than ever, she felt the truth of that in her bones. As she sipped her cocoa, her eyes drifted to the tree in the square, its lights still glowing softly in the distance. She smiled, knowing that this Christmas, despite its challenges, had been the best one yet. The days following the Christmas festival brought a renewed sense of unity to Pinewood Hollow. Conversations about decorations, fines, and holiday spirit seemed to fade, replaced by stories of joy, laughter, and the memories made during the festival. For the first time in years, the town felt connected in a way that transcended differences. For Judge Walter Hainsworth, the festival had marked a turning point. Though his stern exterior remained intact in public, those closest to him began to notice subtle changes. He lingered longer in conversations, offered softer smiles, and even stopped to admire the holiday decorations he had once dismissed as frivolous. The cold isolation he had wrapped himself in for years was beginning to thaw. Walter arrived at the courthouse early on a snowy morning, his boots crunching against the freshly shoveled walkway. Inside, Linda greeted him with her usual efficiency, but there was a warmth in her voice that hadn't been there before. "Good morning, Judge," she said, setting a steaming cup of coffee on his desk. "I heard the festival was a big success." "It was," Walter replied, his tone less formal than usual. "Miss Morrison did an exceptional job." Linda raised an eyebrow, amused. "Miss Morrison? I thought you were mortal enemies." Walter chuckled, surprising even himself. "People change, Linda. Or at least they try." "Well," Linda said with a smile, "it suits you." Later that afternoon, Walter made an unusual decision. He closed the courthouse early, much to Linda's shock, and headed to Kendra Morrison's house. He hadn't planned the visit, but as he walked through the snowy streets, he realized he needed to do more than just apologize. He needed to contribute, to prove that his words at the festival weren't just lip service. When he arrived at 142 Maple Lane, the house was as lively as ever. The decorations were still in full swing, the synchronized lights blinking cheerfully, and the sound of Nat King Cole's The Christmas Song played softly from hidden speakers. Walter took a deep breath and knocked on the door. Kendra opened it, her cheeks flushed from the warmth inside. She looked surprised but not displeased to see him. "Judge," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "What brings you here?" Walter stepped into the cozy living room, glancing around at the decorations that seemed to fill every corner. "I wanted to thank you," he said, "for the festival, for what you've done for this town, and for helping me see things differently." Kendra tilted her head, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Well, that's a first. I think I like this new version of you." Walter chuckled softly, his hands clasped behind his back. "I'm still figuring it out myself." They talked for a while, their conversation meandering from the festival to the town to their own lives. Walter shared stories of Margaret, and for the first time, Kendra saw the depth of his grief. The loss that had shaped him, hardened him, and, in some ways, isolated him. "You know," Kendra said gently, "Margaret sounds a lot like you. Strong, passionate, stubborn." Walter smiled wistfully. "She was the best of me." "She'd be proud of you," Kendra said, "for coming here, for letting people in." Walter didn't reply right away, but his expression softened. "Thank you, Kendra, for saying that." Over the next week, Walter found himself becoming more involved in the town's holiday activities. At Kendra's insistence, he volunteered to help with a community toy drive, spending an afternoon sorting and wrapping gifts for local families in need. Though he was initially hesitant, he found the experience surprisingly rewarding. At one point, a little girl approached him, her wide eyes curious. "Are you Santa?" she asked, eyeing his silver hair. Walter chuckled, crouching down to her level. "Not quite," he said, "but I'll let him know you've been good this year." The girl giggled and ran off, leaving Walter smiling. As Christmas Eve approached, Pinewood Hollow was abuzz with excitement. The town square was lit up once more, this time for a candlelight vigil organized by Kendra. Residents gathered in the cold night air, their breath visible as they held flickering candles and sang carols together. Walter stood near the back of the crowd, his candle casting a soft glow on his face. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace, not just with the town, but with himself. The weight of grief, while still present, no longer felt suffocating. He had found a way to honor Margaret's memory by embracing the spirit of the season she had loved so much. After the vigil, Kendra found him standing by the tree, his candle still burning. She stepped beside him, her own candle held carefully against the cold wind. "You did good tonight," she said. Walter looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "So did you. But then, you always do." Kendra smiled. "You're not so bad yourself, Judge." Walter chuckled, shaking his head. "You're determined to get me to admit I like Christmas, aren't you?" "Not just Christmas," Kendra said. "Life, people, joy." Walter's smile deepened, and for the first time, he didn't resist. "You might just succeed." They stood together in comfortable silence, the tree's lights reflecting off the snow. Around them, the town hummed with quiet joy, the kind of peace that only came on Christmas Eve. And for Walter Hainsworth, it was a beginning. A chance to reclaim the light he had lost and to find hope in the unlikeliest of places. Christmas morning arrived in Pinewood Hollow with the kind of serene beauty that only a snowy winter could provide. The town was quiet, the streets dusted with fresh powder, and the glow of holiday lights reflected softly against the stillness. The air carried a palpable warmth, not from the temperature, but from the shared joy and connection that had blossomed over the past few weeks. For the first time in years, Judge Walter Hainsworth woke up on Christmas morning with a sense of peace. The house, though still quiet, felt less lonely. He had left the courthouse closed for the day, and instead of burying himself in work, he found himself thinking about what the holiday had meant to Margaret and what it could mean for him now. He walked to his living room and paused. For years, this space had remained untouched during the holidays. No tree, no garlands, no reminders of the season. But this year, a modest pine tree stood by the window, its branches adorned with simple white lights and a few ornaments he'd found tucked away in the attic. The tree had been Kendra's idea, of course. "Start small," she'd said, handing him a box of lights and a determined grin. He had protested at first, but in the end, her persistence had won out. And now, as he stood there, gazing at the softly glowing tree, he couldn't help but feel grateful. Walter took a deep breath, pulling on his coat and scarf. He had plans today, something else that hadn't happened in years. Kendra had invited him to join her and a few neighbors for Christmas brunch, and though the thought of spending the holiday surrounded by people still made him a little uneasy, he had agreed. At 142 Maple Lane, the Morrison house was a whirlwind of activity. The smell of cinnamon rolls and coffee filled the air, Christmas music played softly in the background, and Kendra bustled around the kitchen, putting the finishing touches on a spread that could feed an army. The doorbell rang, and she wiped her hands on her apron before hurrying to answer it. Walter stood on the porch, looking slightly out of place with a small wrapped package in his hand. "Merry Christmas," he said, offering a tentative smile. "Merry Christmas, Judge," Kendra replied, stepping aside to let him in. "And you brought a gift? Who are you, and what have you done with Walter Hainsworth?" Walter chuckled, holding out the package. "It's nothing fancy. Just thought it might be appropriate." Kendra accepted the gift, her curiosity piqued. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing a small wooden ornament in the shape of a gavel. Etched into the handle were the words "Joy in Justice." Kendra's eyes softened. "This is really thoughtful. Thank you. I thought it might look good on your tree," Walter said, "considering you've reminded me that justice isn't just about rules. It's about people." Kendra smiled, her heart full. "You're learning, Judge. I'm proud of you." The house filled quickly with neighbors and friends, their laughter and chatter creating a warmth that even the coldest of days couldn't touch. Walter found himself seated at the dining table, surrounded by faces that were once unfamiliar, but now felt like part of something bigger. Something he hadn't realized he'd been missing. Kendra floated between the kitchen and the dining room, refilling coffee cups and sharing stories that had the entire table in stitches. She was the kind of person who made everyone feel at home, and Walter found himself marveling at her ability to bring people together. At one point, Kendra took a seat beside him, her plate piled high with food. "So, what do you think of your first real Christmas in a while?" she asked, nudging him playfully. Walter looked around the room, taking in the smiling faces, the twinkling lights, the hum of joy that seemed to permeate the air. "I think I should have done this a long time ago." "Well," Kendra said with a grin, "you're here now. That's what matters." Walter nodded, his chest feeling lighter than it had in years. For the first time, he truly believed it. As the day wore on, Walter found himself staying longer than he had intended. He helped wash dishes, listened to carols sung by the children, and even joined a spirited game of charades that had the entire room in fits of laughter. By the time he left, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the snowy streets. Kendra walked him to the door, her scarf wrapped tightly around her neck. "Thanks for coming today, Walter," she said. "It meant a lot." "It meant a lot to me too," Walter admitted. "And Kendra, thank you for everything, for not giving up on me." Kendra smiled, her eyes bright. "Hey, it's Christmas. Miracles are kind of the point." Walter chuckled softly, the sound carrying into the crisp evening air. "Merry Christmas, Kendra." "Merry Christmas, Walter," she replied, watching as he walked down the snowy path and disappeared into the twilight. That night, Walter sat by his modest tree, the house quiet once more. But this time, the quiet felt different. It wasn't the heavy silence of loneliness, but a peaceful stillness filled with the echoes of laughter and connection. He sipped a cup of cocoa, a gift from Kendra, and let himself simply be. For the first time in years, he felt not just the absence of Margaret, but the presence of something new. Hope, community, a sense of belonging he hadn't realized he needed. And as the lights on the tree twinkled softly, Walter Hainsworth allowed himself to smile, knowing this Christmas was only the beginning of something much greater.